My name is Emily. I'm 28, and I own a small but growing architectural firm. It's been my dream for as long as I can remember to design spaces that bring people together, and I've worked my ass off to get where I am. My dad has always been my biggest supporter. He's a successful businessman and has given me a ton of advice on running a company. He's also the reason I met Andrew, his assistant, and the man I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with. Andrew is 32, charming, and confident in that way that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room when he talks to you. When we met 3 years ago, it felt like fate. He just started working for my dad, and he was attentive, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in my work and dreams. We got engaged last year, and my dad was thrilled. He even gave us a gorgeous apartment as a wedding gift. Everything felt like a fairy tale, except lately, it started to feel more like a nightmare. I've always been a bit naive, I'll admit that. I like to see the good in people, even when they don't deserve it. But over the past few months, there were moments that made me second-guess Andrew. He started coming home late, claiming work with my dad was just insane right now. His phone was glued to him, and he seemed distracted whenever we were together. I chalked it up to stress. Everyone has rough patches, right? Last night, I worked late on a project for a new shopping center. I've been pouring my heart into this design, and it's kept me at the office into the early hours more than once. When I finally dragged myself home at 3 a.m., exhausted but satisfied with my progress, I noticed something odd, a lipstick-stained wine glass on the counter. Andrew wasn't awake to explain it, and I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Maybe I didn't want to admit it, but a part of me felt like a crack had formed in the foundation of our relationship. Little did I know, that crack was about to grow into a chasm. The lipstick-stained glass haunted me all night. I told myself over and over, it's probably nothing. Maybe he had friends over, or maybe it was just an old glass I hadn't noticed before. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The next morning, I decided to shake it off. I had another long day ahead and couldn't afford to let my imagination get the best of me. Andrew was up early, sipping coffee at the counter like everything was normal. I wanted to ask him about the glass, but I chickened out. Instead, I casually asked, "Did you have someone over last night?" He barely looked up. "No, just me." "Why?" My stomach tightened. It was such a simple answer, but it felt too smooth, too practiced. I shrugged it off, pretending I wasn't slowly unraveling inside. "Oh, I just thought I saw an extra glass in the sink." He chuckled, brushing it off like it was nothing. "Probably just an old one we forgot about. You've been so busy lately. It's easy to miss stuff." I smiled, but it felt fake. I wanted so badly to believe him. He kissed me on the forehead before leaving for work, and I sat there, staring at that damn glass. Later that day, during my lunch break, I texted my best friend, Sarah, to vent. She's been my rock since high school, loyal, funny, and always brutally honest. I didn't tell her everything, just that something felt off. Her response was immediate. "Don't ignore your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is." That evening, as I worked late again, I decided to call it a night early. Maybe Andrew and I just needed some quality time together. I packed up and headed home, ready to surprise him with takeout from his favorite Italian place. When I walked through the door, I froze. Laughter echoed from the living room, and I immediately recognized Sarah's voice. My heart lifted for a second. Maybe she was here to cheer me up, but as I stepped closer, I saw them. Andrew and Sarah, sitting way too close on the couch, a bottle of wine between them. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, clutching the takeout bag so tightly that my knuckles turned white. They hadn't noticed me yet. Andrew was leaning toward Sarah, pouring her another glass of wine, his laugh low and easy. Sarah's hand rested on his arm, her bright smile lighting up the room like she didn't have a care in the world. I cleared my throat, the sound loud and sharp in the otherwise cozy atmosphere. Both of them turned toward me, their smiles vanishing instantly. Andrew was the first to speak. "You're home early," he said, his voice strained as he sat up straighter, moving just an inch too far from Sarah. Sarah's face flushed, and she quickly took a sip of her wine, avoiding my eyes. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I thought I'd surprise you," I said, holding up the takeout bag. My voice didn't shake, but it felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Looks like I'm the one who's surprised. Andrew chuckled nervously. Oh, Sarah just stopped by to hang out. We were catching up. Isn't that right, Sarah? Sarah nodded, her movements stiff and unnatural. Yeah, just catching up. I wanted to believe them. I really did. But something about the scene didn't sit right. The way Sarah's hand lingered a second too long on Andrew's arm, the way they exchanged a glance that seemed to carry a silent conversation, it all felt off. Catching up? I asked, my voice tight. I stepped closer, placing the takeout on the counter. Funny, because I don't remember you mentioning Sarah was coming over, Andrew. And Sarah, you didn't tell me you'd be here either. Andrew stood, his smile too forced. You've been so busy lately. I didn't want to bother you with something small. We were just talking, I swear. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. Yeah, it's nothing. I just needed some advice, and Andrew was here, so... Her excuse trailed off, and I stared at her, feeling the walls close in. Advice about what? Neither of them answered right away. Andrew scratched the back of his neck, his gaze darting to Sarah like he was willing her to speak. Finally, she muttered something about work stress and needing a friend. I didn't buy it, but I didn't push it. Not yet. Instead, I forced a smile, though it felt like my face might crack under the strain. Okay, well, thanks for keeping him company. Sarah quickly excused herself after that, claiming she had an early morning. I didn't stop her. I couldn't even look at her as she left. Once the door closed behind her, I turned to Andrew, my arms crossed. Do you want to tell me what's really going on? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Andrew sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're overthinking this. Sarah just needed someone to talk to. That's all. But the look in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened, everything about him screamed guilt. And yet, I let him convince me it was nothing, at least for now. But the doubt had taken root, and I knew it wasn't going anywhere. After Sarah left, the apartment felt suffocating. Andrew was already back on the couch, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. Meanwhile, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the takeout I'd brought home, my appetite completely gone. Are you mad at me? Andrew's voice cut through the silence, laced with exasperation. He didn't even look up from his phone. Because I really don't think I did anything wrong. I wanted to scream. How could he sit there so casually while I felt like I was coming apart? No, I said, my voice tight. Confused? Yes. You didn't tell me Sarah was coming over, and you didn't think it was worth mentioning? Don't you think that's a little weird? Andrew set his phone down and leaned back, running a hand through his hair like I was the one being unreasonable. I didn't think I needed to give you a play-by-play of my evening. She's your best friend. I thought you'd trust her. That stung. He was flipping it back on me, making me feel like I was the one with the problem. It's not about trust, I said, my voice cracking slightly. It's about respect. If the roles were reversed, and I had one of your friends over late at night while you were working, how would you feel? He hesitated, just for a moment, and that tiny pause told me everything I needed to know. But then he sighed, shaking his head. You're blowing this way out of proportion, Em. There's nothing going on. Can we please not do this tonight? I wanted to argue, to push for more answers, but I was too tired, physically and emotionally. The long hours at work, the constant nagging doubt, the exhaustion of holding everything together, it all hit me at once. So, I swallowed my feelings and nodded, pretending like his explanation was enough. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the scene in the living room. Sarah's nervous laugh, Andrew's too casual demeanor, the way they both seemed so comfortable together. The trust one had in both of them felt like it was slipping through my fingers. And no matter how hard I tried to hold on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, painfully wrong. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe her. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore my gut forever. In the days that followed, I tried to move on. I really did. I buried myself in work, pushing through the final phases of the shopping center project, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Andrew acted like nothing had happened. And for a while, I played along. But once doubt takes root, it's impossible to ignore the little things. Andrew started spending more time out of the apartment. He claimed it was work. Your dad's got me running all over town, he'd say with a laugh. But his excuses felt thinner with every passing day. His phone, once casually left on the counter or coffee table, was now always in his pocket or face down on the nightstand. And when he did get a notification, his body tensed just enough for me to notice. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I was imagining things. But then there were Sarah's messages, or rather, the lack of them. She was my best friend, and we used to talk almost every day, even if it was just to share a funny meme or vent about work. But now, radio silence. I finally broke down and texted her. Hey, are you okay? Haven't heard from you in a while. She replied hours later. Hey, sorry. Just been super busy with work. Let's catch up soon. Her message was cheerful enough, but something about it felt off. She didn't suggest a specific time to meet, which was unusual for her. Sarah was the kind of person who'd already have her calendar out before you even finished asking to hang out. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest, but it was like trying to ignore a storm brewing on the horizon. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know when. The final straw came a week later. I was leaving the office late again, exhausted but relieved that the shopping center project was nearly complete. As I walked to my car, I spotted Andrew across the street. My heart lifted for a moment. Maybe he'd come to surprise me. But he wasn't alone. Sarah was with him. They were standing too close, their heads bent together as they laughed about something I couldn't hear. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and my stomach dropped. I ducked behind a parked car, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. What the hell was I looking at? They didn't notice me. After a few minutes, they walked off together, heading down the street. I didn't follow them. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my mind was racing with 1,000 questions I didn't want answers to. When I finally got home that night, Andrew was already there, acting like everything was normal. Hey babe, he said with a grin. How was work? I didn't know how to respond. My throat was tight, my mind swirling with what I'd just seen. So I did what I'd been doing for weeks. I pushed it down. I told myself I'd deal with it later. But deep down, I knew there was no more pretending. The weight of what I'd seen that night didn't go away. It grew heavier with each passing day. Andrew continued his usual routine, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. Sarah, on the other hand, remained distant. It was like she'd vanished from my life, and the void she left only made her absence more suspicious. I tried to focus on my work, but even that wasn't enough to distract me. The shopping center project, something I'd been so proud of, now felt like a chore. Every time I closed my laptop at night, I was left alone with my thoughts, and they were relentless. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, even if I wasn't ready for what they might be. So, one evening, after Andrew had left for another work meeting, I decided to check his laptop. It was risky, but I couldn't ignore my gut anymore. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, or rather, what I was terrified to find. In his email, buried among work correspondence and spam, was a string of messages between him and Sarah. My hands trembled as I read them. At first, they seemed innocent enough, inside jokes, quick check-ins, but the tone shifted as I scrolled further. The messages became flirtatious, then explicit. They referenced stolen moments, late-night meetings, and even the apartment, my father's gift to us. One email in particular made my stomach churn. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you, and we'll never find out. I slammed the laptop shut, my breathing uneven. It felt like the walls were closing in, the room spinning around me. How could this be happening? The man I was planning to marry, the man I thought I knew, had been betraying me with my best friend. And worse, they'd done it here in my home. When Andrew came home that night, I was waiting for him. He walked through the door, his usual cocky grin in place, but it vanished the second he saw my face. "Ink? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice laced with fake concern. I held up his laptop, my jaw tight. Care to explain this? His eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw panic. But he quickly recovered, putting on his usual charm. I can explain." "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. My voice shook, but I didn't care. I saw everything, Andrew. The emails, the messages. With Sarah. How long has this been going on? He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, and it confirmed what I already knew. My heart shattered, and tears spilled down my cheeks. I trusted you, I whispered, my voice breaking. I trusted both of you. Andrew reached for me, but I stepped back, my hands trembling. Don't. Just don't. I don't even want to look at you right now. For the first time, he looked genuinely shaken. Please, let me explain. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? I repeated, my voice rising. You destroyed everything we had for something that didn't mean anything? Do you even hear yourself? He tried again, but I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and left the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Not with him. I drove aimlessly that night, my thoughts racing. Tears blurred my vision, and my chest felt like it was being crushed by the weight of what I'd just uncovered. I ended up at a quiet park, parking the car and collapsing onto a bench beneath a cluster of trees. The cold night air stung my skin, but I didn't care. I needed to feel something, anything other than the pain twisting in my chest. How had it come to this? I replayed every moment in my head, analyzing every interaction with Andrew and Sarah over the past few months. The stolen glances, the inside jokes I'd brushed off, the sudden distance in my friendship with Sarah, it had all been right there in front of me, and I'd been too blind to see it. Or maybe I hadn't wanted to see it. Hours passed before I finally returned to the apartment. I expected Andrew to be waiting for me, ready with more excuses or apologies. But the place was eerily quiet. His shoes were still by the door, but he wasn't in the living room or the kitchen. Then I saw the note on the counter. I know I messed up. Please let me explain. I'll stay at a hotel tonight to give you space. We need to talk. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. The last thing I wanted was to hear more lies. My body felt heavy as I dragged myself to the bedroom, but when I opened the door, it hit me all over again. The bed we'd shared now felt like a monument to his betrayal. I grabbed a blanket and pillow and crashed on the couch instead. The next morning, I woke up to a dozen missed calls and texts from Andrew. Please, just let me explain. I made a mistake, but I love you. Can we talk? I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I ignored every one of them. I couldn't face him, not yet. Instead, I called my dad, who immediately picked up. Emily, everything okay? Hearing his voice nearly broke me. I hadn't told him anything yet, but I knew I couldn't keep it from him for long. My dad adored Andrew. He'd trusted him just like I had. How was I supposed to explain that the man he'd practically brought into our lives had betrayed me in the worst way possible? Dad, I said, my voice trembling, I need some time off. Just a few days. He didn't ask any questions, but I could hear the concern in his voice. Of course. Take as much time as you need. Let me know if there's anything I can do. After we hung up, I sat there, staring at my phone. I was at a crossroads, and I didn't know which way to turn. Part of me wanted to confront Sarah, to demand answers and closure. Another part of me wanted to shut out the world entirely. But one thing was clear. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The next day, I woke up with a singular purpose. I needed to confront Sarah. Ignoring Andrew's relentless calls and texts, I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and drove to her apartment. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. A mix of anger, heartbreak, and betrayal bubbled inside me, threatening to spill over at any moment. When I arrived, I hesitated for a moment before knocking. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, unsure if she'd even be home. But then the door opened, and there she was, my best friend, the person I thought I could trust more than anyone else in the world. She said, her voice tinged with surprise and what I could only describe as guilt. What are you doing here? I pushed past her into the apartment, not caring about politeness. We need to talk, I said, my voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. She closed the door and turned to face me, her arms crossed defensively. What's going on? Don't play dumb, Sarah. I snapped, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I know about you and Andrew. Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But then she let out a shaky sigh and sat down on the couch, her head in her hands. I didn't mean for it to happen. My chest tightened. Hearing her admit it made it so much worse. Didn't mean for what to happen? You slept with my fiancé, Sarah. How could you do this to me? She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with tears. I don't know. It just happened. It was a mistake, I swear. I never wanted to hurt you. A mistake? I repeated, my voice rising. Sleeping with him once might have been a mistake, but the emails, the late nights, the flirting, it wasn't a one-time thing, was it? She didn't answer, and her silence was all the confirmation I needed. My legs felt weak, and I sank into the chair across from her, my mind reeling. This was Sarah, the girl who had been by my side through everything. How could she betray me like this? Why? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why him? Why now? Sarah wiped at her tears, her face a mix of shame and regret. I don't know him. He was just there. He listened to me, made me feel special. I know it's not an excuse, but things in my life have been so messy lately, and She trailed off, and I shook my head in disbelief. So you decided to destroy my life to make yourself feel better? Do you even hear how selfish that sounds? I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. But her apology didn't feel like enough, not when the damage was already done. I stood, unable to be in the same room as her any longer. Sorry doesn't fix this, Sarah. Sorry doesn't give me back my trust in you, or in him. As I walked toward the door, she called after me, her voice desperate. Please, don't let this ruin everything we've had. I turned back, tears streaming down my face. You already ruined it. And with that, I left, slamming the door behind me. The moment I stepped outside, I broke down, sobs racking my body as the weight of her betrayal hit me all over again. I'd lost not only my fiancé, but also my best friend. I don't remember how I got home that day. The drive back was a blur of tears and shaky breaths, my mind replaying Sarah's words over and over. It was a mistake, but it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. They both made deliberate, conscious decisions that betrayed me, and now I was the one left to deal with the aftermath. When I walked into the apartment, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Andrew's things were still scattered around, his jacket on the chair, his mug on the counter. The sight of them made my stomach turn. I couldn't stay here, not with all these reminders of him and what he'd done. I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started throwing clothes into it. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I needed to get out. Every corner of this place felt tainted, like the walls themselves were mocking me. By the time I finished packing, I decided to call my dad. Emily, he answered on the first ring, his voice warm and reassuring. What's wrong? The moment I heard his voice, the tears came again. Dad, I need to stay with you for a little while. There was a pause, and then, of course, come over whenever you need. I didn't tell him why, not yet. I wasn't ready to have that conversation. But as I drove to his house, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. My dad had always been my rock, but how would he react when he found out the truth? He'd trusted Andrew too, had welcomed him into our family. When I arrived, my dad was waiting at the door. He took one look at my tear-streaked face and pulled me into a hug. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out, he said softly. For the first time in days, I felt a small glimmer of hope. I didn't have all the answers yet, but at least I wasn't facing this alone. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. I stayed at my dad's house, avoiding Andrew's calls and texts while trying to focus on work. My dad didn't press me for details, but I could tell he was worried. Every now and then, he'd check in with a gentle, "Are you okay? Or do you need anything?" I finally told him the truth over dinner one night. His face darkened as I recounted everything. Andrew's betrayal, Sarah's involvement, the emails. By the time I finished, his hands were clenched into fists on the table. "That bastard," he muttered, his voice low and angry. I trusted him. I trusted him with you." Hearing his anger somehow made me feel better, like I wasn't overreacting or being too emotional. "I don't know what to do, Dad," I admitted. "Part of me wants to end it all right now, but another part of me wonders if it's salvageable." My dad shook his head, his expression softening. "Emily, you deserve someone who respects you, who values you, not someone who lies and cheats. Andrew made his choice. Now it's time for you to make yours. His words stuck with me long after the conversation ended. I wasn't ready to decide just yet, but I knew he was right. This wasn't just about Andrew anymore. It was about me and what I was willing to tolerate in my life. After a week of avoiding him, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. Andrew had called and texted incessantly, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to desperate. Each time my phone buzzed, a fresh wave of anxiety hit me. But deep down, I knew I needed to confront him. I needed closure, if not for him, then for myself. I texted him one word, talk. He replied almost immediately, yes. When and where? I told him to meet me at the apartment. It was still technically ours, though I hadn't been there since the night I left. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of our home hit me like a punch to the gut. Everything looked the same, yet it all felt so different. When Andrew arrived, he looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and his usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. He said softly, stepping inside. Thank you for agreeing to talk. I've been going crazy. I crossed my arms, staying near the door. Say what you need to say. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I messed up. I know I did. I was stupid and selfish, and I don't even know how to begin making it right. I stared at him, waiting for more. The words felt rehearsed, like he'd been practicing them in the mirror. Why, Andrew? Why her? Was it worth it? He flinched at the sharpness in my voice. It wasn't worth it, Em. It was a mistake, a horrible, thoughtless mistake. I don't even know why it happened. I guess I felt, I don't know, unappreciated, like I was just a supporting character in your life. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and foreign in the quiet room. Unappreciated? Are you kidding me? I gave you everything, Andrew. My trust, my love, this apartment. Hell, my dad gave you a job. What more could you have possibly wanted? He didn't have an answer. Instead, he looked down at his hands, his silence infuriating me even more. I saw the emails, I said, my voice trembling. Do you even know what it's like to read the words, "Last night was incredible," from the man you're supposed to marry? Andrew's head snapped up, his face pale. No, I interrupted, holding up a hand. You don't get to explain it away. You betrayed me, Andrew. And you didn't just hurt me, you humiliated me. With my best friend, no less. Tears welled up in his eyes, but I felt no sympathy. I love you, he whispered. I still love you, Em. Please don't throw this away. We can fix it. I shook my head, the weight of his words crashing over me. You already threw it away, Andrew. The moment you touched her, the moment you lied to me, you made that choice. The room fell silent, the tension between us thick and suffocating. I felt tears streaming down my face, but I didn't bother wiping them away. I deserve better, I said quietly, the realization hitting me like a breath of fresh air. And you don't deserve another chance. Andrew's face crumpled, but I didn't wait to see his reaction. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, leaving him behind. This time I wasn't running away, I was walking towards something better. Leaving the apartment that day felt like ripping off a bandage. The pain was raw and immediate, but as I stepped into the cool evening air, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It was over. The relationship I'd once thought would last forever was officially done. I had made my decision, and there was no going back. The first few days after the breakup were brutal. I moved back in with my dad temporarily, and while he didn't push for details, I could see the worry in his eyes. He tried to distract me with small things, a cup of coffee in the morning, casual conversations about work, but I was a shell of myself. My emotions swung wildly between anger, sadness, and a strange numbness that scared me the most. Andrew didn't stop trying to contact me. He left voicemails, sent long-winded texts, and even tried to show up at my dad's house. I didn't answer the door. My dad, always protective, made it clear to him that his presence wasn't welcome. Then there was Sarah. She sent me a single text. Em, I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope one day you'll understand how much I regret what I've done. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to deal with her, and honestly, I didn't know if I ever would be. Work became my lifeline. The shopping center project was nearing its final stages, and I threw myself into every detail, working late into the night to keep my mind busy. My team, sensing that something was wrong, rallied around me in quiet support. They didn't ask questions, but their kindness was a balm for my wounded soul. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found myself sitting in the office alone, staring at the blueprint in front of me. For the first time in weeks, the tears came without warning. I cried for everything I'd lost, for the relationship I thought I had, for the betrayal of my best friend, for the future I'd imagined with Andrew that now lay in ruins. But as the tears slowed, a new emotion crept in: determination. This wasn't the end of my story. Yes, Andrew and Sarah had hurt me, but they didn't define me. I was stronger than this, and I wasn't going to let their betrayal ruin my life. I wiped my face, packed up my things, and headed home. That night, I started making a list, a plan for moving forward. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The list I made that night became my anchor. At first, it was filled with small, manageable tasks. Take a walk every morning. Call a friend who isn't Sarah. Organize my office. Find a therapist. Each item felt like a tiny step toward reclaiming the person I'd been before Andrew and Sarah's betrayal shattered me. It wasn't easy, but every time I checked something off, I felt a flicker of hope that I could rebuild my life. One of the first calls I made was to Lily, an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in months. She was surprised to hear from me, but her warm, enthusiastic voice reminded me of how much I'd missed her. "Emily," she exclaimed, "I was just thinking about you. How's life? How's Andrew?" There it was, the question I'd been dreading. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to tell her the truth. "Andrew and I broke up," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What?" she gasped. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. What happened?" "It's a long story," I said, not ready to dive into the messy details. "But I realized I need to make some changes, and I wanted to reconnect with people who actually care about me." Lily didn't press for more. Instead, she said, "I'm here for you. Let's grab coffee soon, okay?" That simple offer felt like a lifeline. Over the next few weeks, I slowly started reconnecting with people I'd drifted away from during my relationship with Andrew. It wasn't that he'd ever explicitly told me to distance myself. It was more subtle than that. I'd been so focused on building a life with him that I hadn't noticed how much of myself I'd given up along the way. Therapy was another big step. Talking to a professional felt strange at first, but it quickly became a safe space where I could process everything I was feeling. My therapist helped me unpack the betrayal and reminded me that their actions weren't a reflection of my worth. That was something I needed to hear more than I realized. Work, as always, was my steadying force. The shopping center project was completed, and the grand opening was set for the following month. My team threw a small celebration in the office the day we handed over the final designs, and for the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely proud of myself. I'd created something tangible, something that would last, even as so much of my personal life was in flux. One evening, while scrolling through my phone, I came across a photo of Andrew and me from the early days of our relationship. We were smiling, carefree, and in love, or so I'd thought. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by something else: gratitude. Not for him, but for the lessons I'd learned. Losing Andrew and Sarah had been devastating, but it forced me to take a hard look at my life and figure out what really mattered. Slowly but surely, I was starting over, not as the person I'd been with them, but as someone stronger, wiser, and ready to move forward. Moving on wasn't a straight path. Some days, I felt like I was making progress, ready to leave the pain behind and embrace a new chapter. Other days, it felt like I was back at square one, consumed by memories of what had happened. But over time, the bad days became fewer and farther between. One of the biggest turning points came when I decided to redecorate the apartment. I'd avoided going back for weeks, but it was still technically mine, and I didn't want to give it up. Instead, I wanted to reclaim it. The space had been tainted by Andrew and Sarah, but I was determined to make it my own again. I spent an entire weekend painting the walls, swapping out furniture, and filling the apartment with things that brought me joy. Bright, bold artwork replaced the muted tones Andrew had preferred. The bed was stripped and replaced with new linens in cheerful colors. I even turned what had been Andrew's work corner into a cozy reading nook for myself. When I was done, the apartment felt unrecognizable, not as a place I'd shared with him, but as a space that was entirely mine. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, curled up in my new reading nook, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. Socially, I was starting to find my footing again. Coffee with Lily turned into regular meetups, and she even introduced me to a few of her friends. They were kind, funny, and refreshingly drama-free. For the first time in years, I realized how much I'd missed having a circle of people who cared about me without any ulterior motives. Andrew, meanwhile, had stopped reaching out. Whether he'd finally given up or moved on, I didn't know, and I didn't care. Sarah had also disappeared from my life entirely, and while her absence still stung, I knew it was for the best. One day, I bumped into someone unexpected. Liam, a contractor I'd worked with on a previous project. He was dropping off supplies at a nearby site, and we ended up chatting for a few minutes. I'd always liked Liam. He was easygoing, smart, and had a knack for making everyone around him feel comfortable. "I heard about the shopping center," he said with a smile. "Congrats on finishing it. It looks amazing." "Thanks," I said, feeling a blush creep up my cheeks. It was a lot of work, but I'm proud of how it turned out. We exchanged numbers under the guise of work connections, but over the next few weeks, we started texting regularly. Our conversations ranged from architecture and construction to books, movies, and everything in between. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people enjoying each other's company. One evening, after a particularly long text exchange, Liam asked, "Coffee sometime?" No pressure, just as friends. I hesitated for a moment, still unsure if I was ready to put myself out there again. But then I thought about everything I'd been through, all the progress I'd made. This wasn't about replacing Andrew or forgetting what had happened. It was about taking a step forward. "I'd like that," I replied. The coffee date with Liam was casual, almost disarmingly so. We met at a small cafe near my office, one I'd frequented countless times before, but that day it felt different, lighter. Liam greeted me with his signature easy smile, and for the first time in a long while, I felt my shoulders relax. Over lattes and pastries, we talked about everything except relationships. He told me about the challenges of his latest project, a sprawling library renovation, and I shared some ideas for an upcoming boutique hotel I was designing. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and I realized how refreshing it was to be with someone who wasn't tied to the baggage of my recent past. At one point, Liam leaned back in his chair, studying me thoughtfully. "You seem stronger," he said, his tone sincere. "Stronger?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Yet he said, nodding. "I don't know what you've been through, but it feels like you've come out the other side. You're different in a good way." His words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't told him about Andrew or Sarah, not yet, but somehow, he saw through the layers I'd been trying to rebuild. "Thanks," I said softly. "It hasn't been easy, but I'm getting there." The coffee date turned into a second meeting, and then a third. Each time, I found myself looking forward to our conversations more and more. Liam wasn't just a distraction. He was a reminder that there were still good, genuine people in the world. And while I wasn't ready to call it anything more than friendship, I couldn't deny the flicker of hope he sparked in me. Outside of my time with Liam, I continued focusing on myself. Therapy sessions became a cornerstone of my routine, helping me untangle the lingering threads of guilt and self-doubt that Andrew and Sarah had left behind. My relationships with Lily and my other friends flourished, and I started saying yes to invitations I might have once ignored, happy hours, hiking trips, even a pottery class that left me covered in clay, but surprisingly happy. Work, too, was thriving. The success of the shopping center had brought in new clients, and my firm was busier than ever. I threw myself into each project with renewed passion, determined to build something lasting, not just for my clients, but for myself. One evening, while sketching designs for a new client, I caught a glimpse of the list I'd made weeks ago, now pinned to the edge of my corkboard. Most of the items were checked off, but one stood out: learn to trust again. I stared at it for a long moment, realizing that while the scars of betrayal hadn't disappeared, they no longer defined me. I was learning to trust, slowly, cautiously, but I was doing it on my terms. Months later, as I sat in the newly finished boutique hotel lobby I had designed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The sunlight streamed through the massive glass windows, casting warm patterns across the polished floors. It was the kind of space I'd dreamed of creating when I first started my firm: beautiful, inviting, and full of life. In many ways, it mirrored how I felt inside. The road to this moment hadn't been easy. There were nights I cried until I couldn't breathe, days I doubted whether I'd ever feel whole again. But here I was, on the other side of it all, stronger than I'd ever thought possible. Andrew and I hadn't spoken since our confrontation at the apartment. He eventually stopped calling, and while I occasionally heard about him through mutual acquaintances, he no longer occupied space in my mind. Sarah, too, had disappeared from my life. I wished her no ill will, but I knew we could never go back to the way things were. And I was okay with that. Liam had become an unexpected bright spot in my life. Our friendship deepened over the months, and though neither of us rushed into anything romantic, there was a quiet understanding between us, a mutual respect and care that felt grounding and real. Whether it turned into something more or not, I knew I'd found someone who valued me for who I was, without pretense or expectation. But most importantly, I'd found myself again. The version of me that had been buried under years of compromises and heartbreak was re-emerging, bolder, more confident, and fiercely independent. I was no longer defined by the people who had hurt me. Instead, I was defined by how I'd chosen to rise above it. If I could go back and give my past self advice, it would be this: trust your gut. Never let anyone make you feel small. And remember that even the worst betrayals can't take away your worth. As I stood to leave the hotel, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Liam. Dinner tonight? No pressure, just as friends. I smiled, shaking my head at his playful tone. For the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely excited about what the future might hold.